Hello, and welcome to our second video of the year for map growth data. By now, you should have taken your winter 2025-2026 test. Our outcome for today is that teachers will create a shared understanding of map growth and learn ways to use the map growth data to differentiate instruction. We're going to go back to our first video, and what is the purpose of a universal screener? A universal screener is a systematic process that uses appropriate measures for identifying students who may be at risk of poor learning outcomes, which includes academic, behavioral, social, emotional, school completion, and college and career readiness. Universal screening is the Tier 1 assessment of all students, which checks for their success and their mastery indicators based off of our Tier 1 instruction. It also provides data for our PLCs to check the effectiveness of core instruction and curriculum. And then we also look at our Tier 2 and our Tier 3 students to provide support. So again, our emphasis is Tier 1, which should target 80% of our students. Our Tier 2 should be about 15 to 20% of our students. And then our Tier 3, which is our greatest need, should be our Tier 3 students. Now, how is the RIT band identified? What MAP does is it checks for where the students are getting half of the questions correct and half of them incorrect. And it puts them in a RIT band based off of how they answered those questions. What do those questions look like? So for math, we have some RIT bands here. So from our 201 to 210, we have picture shows a figure made of stacked cubes. What is the volume? And then we go to our 250, which is our highest RIT band, and it's talking about diameter of a sphere. For reading, we have 211 to 220, and it talks about which word best matches the connotative meaning of ferocious as it is used in the sentence. And then above 230, it's based on understanding of Latin roots. What is the meaning of ambidextrous? There are multiple questions based off of these RIT bands, and it builds upon one another. Now, MAP this last year updated their system, and they try to keep students as close to grade level as possible. So the new algorithm chooses, and this is for a fifth grade student, the question based off of how they answer, and then it scaffolds them, but it tries to keep them as close to grade level as possible. So if their first choice they get right, it'll move them up. If it gets it wrong, they'll move them down, and it tries to bring them back as close to grade level as possible. Now in map growth, there are two key reports that we want to look at. So now that you've taken your second test, your students should have data based off of their first test and their second test. So there's two reports we want to look at. The first is the class profile, and the second is the student profile. Now, in the class profile, you're going to have stacks of students who are represented with a 10-point RIT range for whatever instructional area that you have chosen. And if you notice on the picture here, there are instructional areas. So this one says geometry, and it's a drop down, so you can choose different instructional areas, and it'll rank your students according to how they scored in that area. Now going back to our RIT score is based on one administration and it's nationally normed. Now you have two different scores here. You have your achievement, you have your achievement percentile. Now, 50th percentile means that your student is on average for that grade level. I know we look at 50th percentile sometimes and we think that's low, but that is average for nationally normed. So here what we have is our fall average for sixth grade, which is 214. And then we have our winter average, which is 219. So if you notice, our scores have gone up 5 points from fall to winter. The SD column means our standard deviation, which standard deviation means that if you look at our 50th percentile, the standard deviation, both positive and negative, both ways, is 16.74 for that score, which means a student can be 50th percentile, but they can also deviate up 16 points and down 16 points and still be in that mean, that average of the national norm. Now, how do you access your class profile for instructional areas? So if you look at when you log in, you're going to have a tab that says Map Growth, and you're going to select Class Profile. Under Class Profile, you can select Instructional Areas, which will give you a little better picture of how your kids scored and why they scored the way they did. Now let's look at some class scenarios. So we're going to look at some things like, based on the achievement norm, what is the academic diversity of my class? How did they score and why? How many RIP bands are represented within my class? You might have some classes that are very close in their scoring. You might have some classes a little bit more diverse. And how can I provide supports to reach each group of students? So if you have a student who scored really high on their RIP band, and then you have another student who scored really low, what are the supports that I need to provide for those students? So let's look at this group here. So this instructional area is computations and algebraic relationships. And we have students here who scored from the 181, 190 RIT band to the 221, 230 RIT band. So what are the instructional moves that I might have to have for this group? Now what I want you to notice that a lot of my students are above 200. And if we go back and look at our sixth grade RIT scores, they are performing at or just above the norm, and I have one student who's performing below. So what are the instructional moves that I might need to make for this group? Here's a different group. Again, same instructional area, but I have my students kind of spread out here now, and I have 4 students who are in the 181 to 190 group, and I have one student who's in the 221 to 230 group. So this might be a different instructional move for this group because of the way my students are spread out. Here again, I have 3 students who are in the 181 to 190 group. I have 3 students who are in the 201 to 210 group. So what are the instructional moves that I might need for this group? For me, I have my student here in the 211 to 220, and then I have a student in the 221 to 230 group. I would empower those students to help out these students who are in the lower RIP bands. Now, what happens when I change the instructional area? So as you notice here, I have students kind of spread out across the RIP bands. Now, when you change your instructional area, your students are going to shift dependent on how they scored in that instructional area. Now for class scenarios, how might how might your grouping strategy change with each instructional area? And what instructional implications are there when my class bands change with each instructional area? So like I said, when you change those instructional areas, your students are going to shift. Some might be really good at one area and they might have scored lower in another area. It's very important that we look at the instructional area that we're currently in or moving into to place our students accordingly. Which brings us to our next section, which instructional area addresses our upcoming unit. So this is a math picture, but looking at it, if I'm coming up on geometry or measurement, I want to make sure that my students are grouped accordingly in this instructional area. So I want to shift my instructional area view to see my students who are on the lower RIP bands, on the middle RIP bands, and the higher RIP bands so I can place them accordingly. Now going into student scenarios. Why is it important to talk to students about their data? And how do you prepare to talk to your students about their assessment data? What are the next steps? So my pictures here shows my first instructional area for reading, and then the bottom picture shows growth over time, which shows that my student had a dip in winter 19, but then continued to grow above for the fall of 20. So your student profile is going to look as such. And as you notice, currently we're looking at mathematics, but it also shows reading, language, and science as well. So all those are areas tested at different grade levels. You can also click those. They'll access different areas of that student. So here we have Richard Thompson, who's grade 7, and it'll show you exactly where they scored. So here we have Richard Thompson, who our standard error of deviation is 2.9, which means that he's 2.9 either way of what he scored. So he scored a 240. So we're looking at a 237 to a 243. He took 60 minutes. Rapid guessing, he had none, which means that if a student is continuing to guess or they're going through a question quick, it'll show that there. And it had no impact on his score because he didn't rapid guess. So if we notice here, his RIT score for operations and algebraic thinking was a 235. If we look to the left here, his growth mean is a 50th, which means he's on average, he's 50%. His achievement is above the average, which is 87th percent, which means that his growth is average nationally based on his group, and his achievement, which is his actual score, is 87th percent, which is well above his average for his group. Now here we have his reading score, which again, our standard error is 3.5. His range is 210 to 217, which is at plus or minus 3.5. He took 60 minutes. He had no rapid guessing, which is great. And then also, as you notice, you can see his math score, his language usage score, and his science score as well. We scroll down and we look at his growth mean. So his growth mean was below average. He was 45th percent, which means he is 5% below average. And his achievement on reading is 47th, which means, again, he's below average. So as you notice, it says low growth, low achievement. It's because he's below the average of what the nationally normed numbers are. Now, a couple things too. If you notice, his literature is a 210, his vocabulary and acquisition and use is a 214, and informational text is a 217. So if he scored a 213, his literature is a little bit low compared to the national average. Now what? What do you do with this information? What's next? So once you look at your students who are grouped by instructional areas, there is a link at the very bottom that talks about the learning continuum. This learning continuum goes into more detail of what the RIT bands look like and the skills the students need to improve on based off of their RIT score. Now again, when you click on this, you're going to explore a specific instructional area that aligns to whatever upcoming unit. And when you explore a specific RIT band, it's going to tell you what types of questions will students in this band experience on the MAP test. So again, when you go into the learning continuum, you have your 10-point RIT band by instructional area. It'll also include a standard and learning statements that go along with that standard. So looking at this data, it's very important that you look at the RIT band and group your students accordingly because those are the things that they're missing when they took this test. And again, these statements are aligned to the questions that they got right or wrong 50% of the time. So it's very important, like this one here says, solve one-step additive comparison word problems, numbers within 20. So if your students are in this RIT band, that's the things that they are missing or that they need. And again, going back, we want to get our students as close to grade level as possible. We want to keep them on that purple line there. That's where most of our students, 80% of our students, should live. Now, you're going to have students who excel there, so we want to build that scaffold. Or you might have students who need help getting to that grade level standard, so we want to differentiate. So it's very important that we look at this data and these resources to see where our students are at in order to plan accordingly. And again, if you have questions, all map growth info is on the hub.